The Prime Minister has requested that the next sitting fortnight be cancelled because of coronavirus. Do you think that's a fair call to make?
No, I don't really. The government has spent the past few months urging a lot of Australian businesses to get COVID safe. And I think it's completely unacceptable that the Prime Minister hasn't prepared the Australian Parliament to be COVID safe. It's our premier decision-making body. It's important to our democracy that Parliament is functioning through this global pandemic and that the Parliament can apply scrutiny to these government decisions. It's spending tens of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. In a lot of cases, it's making huge and consequential decisions that impact on people's everyday lives. And I just don't think it's good enough that this far into the pandemic, we can't have Parliament sitting virtually or some other mechanism when, because we're pursuing a suppression strategy, the idea that we'd have these outbreaks, was bound to come up. And yeah, I just think it's unacceptable that the Parliament isn't prepared.
Evan, do you agree?
I think we're on a uni ticket here. I think it's outrageous that Parliament's not sitting. I can't think of a time in the last century where it's been more important and significant to scrutinise government decisions.
Right.
They're asking business to run at a limited capacity and can't even do it themselves. In the UK, even at the height of the pandemic, they were able to come up with ways where there was remote voting and people were able to scrutinise government decisions. And at the federal level, they have a very good cross-party COVID committee, Senate committee, which is able to scrutinise all the measures going through at the moment, very important measures going through at the moment, and not following the lead of states like Victoria, which has blocked all attempts at parliamentary scrutiny over government decisions and suspended Parliament basically completely. This is a bad precedent for Scott Morrison to follow Victoria down this route.
Ebony, a growing number of Labor MPs are urging Anthony Albanese to take a more moderate approach to climate change, many saying that's the only way he'll become Prime Minister one day. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree. What's important is whether it's Anthony Albanese or the Prime Minister is that Australia's climate policy reflects scientific reality and what the scientific experts say is required. And the uncertainty here, it does not come from the Labor side of politics, but from the coalition, who still don't have any kind of reasonable climate or energy policy. But the good news for consumers is that more renewable electricity and renewable energy will make electricity prices cheaper, which is why the Australia Institute joined forces with Mike Cannon-Brookes and other energy leaders this week with an open letter to COAG, really urging COAG to take this opportunity to bring forward a lot of reforms to our national electricity market, which for too long has been anti-competitive and trying to exclude things like wholesale demand response and new entrants from renewables and battery storage into the market, and bringing those reforms forward now during this pandemic will unleash massive investment in renewables and massive job opportunities in the future. And it's absolutely a switch that we have to make. And that's the kind of certainty that business requires if it's going to make really long-term investments in energy and electricity infrastructure. So I think that's one of the key things that needs to happen at the moment, not any move to water down our climate policy, but to get one from the coalition government that we can stick to.
Evan, do you think Anthony Albanese would have a better chance at becoming PM if Labor took a more moderate approach to climate change?
Absolutely. As a political tragic I am, I know, and surely the hardheads in Labor would know, that there's no electoral pathway to government for Labor without winning over mining communities in Queensland, WA and New South Wales. And it is encouraging that Anthony Albanese is supportive of the new Acland coal mine and acknowledges the burdensome effect of environmental regulations. It's good to see Labor senators like Raf Ciccone out this morning acknowledging that and saying we need to streamline some of our environmental laws to support blue-collar jobs. A good place to start would be Section 487 of our environmental laws, which we've estimated has put up to $65 billion of investment at risk in Australia because it allows environmental green groups from the inner city to challenge projects that they have no material relation to. Since 2000, environmental regulations have increased by 445% and have really become burdensome on our agricultural industry, our resources industry and our agricultural industry.
I want to get both your thoughts on the coronavirus situation in Victoria. Ebony, some health experts now calling for Victoria to impose tougher restrictions. We had more than 400 cases yesterday. Do you think that's a road we should take?
Well, I think the problem here is that whatever restrictions are in place, it takes up to 2 weeks to see the impacts of those. And so it's really hard to judge, I think, for health professionals whether or not the restrictions in place are working. And of course, no one wants this pandemic to get out of control from these couple of outbreaks in Victoria. That's the key thing here. I thought it was really interesting that Daniel Andrews introduced paid leave for people who are being forced to self-isolate if they've either been quarantined or are at risk or indeed have COVID-19. And that's really important, and I think shows that for a lot of people trying to comply, everyone wants to do the right thing here, but it's a highly infectious disease. And for a lot of people, they might ignore that tickle in their throat or perhaps not get tested. And if they're not going to be able to put food on the table because they might have a casual job, have no paid leave, or otherwise be in insecure employment. And I think that really points to a much bigger problem that we haven't confronted nationwide, is that outbreaks are going to keep occurring until we have a vaccine or treatment. And we have to be able to encourage the community, not punitively, not with a law and order response, not with a police response, but we have to encourage the community to comply and keep one another safe. And I think paid leave is one of the best ways that we can do that. And that's why the ACTU has been calling for it.
Evan, what are your thoughts on this? The lockdown's already going to be costing the economy about $1 billion a week. Do you think locking down Melbourne further would cause more harm than good?
Yeah, I think people are struggling enough with the lockdown as is, and we don't even know the exact details of what a stage 4 would look like. And the panic around the rumours around a stage 4 lockdown is causing even greater anxiety than what is already in place. Lockdowns like this require cooperation and trust from the people, that governments know what they're doing and have the capacity to keep them safe and apply the rules equally, and trust from the government in the people that they'll follow their edicts. And I think the Victorian government broke their end of that very important bargain when they mishandled the hotel quarantine and also allowed 10,000 protesters to march in the city without consequence, while still dishing out the most fines of any state in the country, punishing small businesses for having one person over capacity and dishing out silly rules. So I don't think an extra lockdown is the way to go.
It'll be interesting when that inquiry gets underway on Monday. Now, New South Wales is tightening restrictions because of coronavirus. Ebony, do you think they're taking the right approach? And also, what are your thoughts on masks? They're not mandated, but it's the advice that Melburnians should be wearing them when they can't socially distance. Do you think New South Wales should be adopting that policy too?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think some of the best advice I heard was from the ABC's Norman Swan early on. And he said, when you're out in the community, you have to behave like you have the virus already and you don't want to pass it on to anyone else. And so I think masks seem to be useful in that respect, not so much, to prevent the transmission, but it's individually, it helps people prevent transmission. So that's one thing that we should certainly be looking at. But I do think the differences between New South Wales and Victoria point to a larger problem. Evan's right to say that I think the community finds these differences in restrictions difficult to follow. New Zealand had very clear 4 different stages of restrictions, and that applied nationwide. I appreciate that a lot of states are in very different circumstances here. Most of the states, except for New South Wales and Victoria, have pretty much managed elimination of the virus and no community transmission. But that's not going to be the case in New South Wales and Victoria in the long term. But it's very hard, I think, for people to comply when, restrictions are changing sometimes almost daily, and it's not always clear the differences that are applying, between different areas of the country. So I think it's really important that we get clear communication from state and federal governments into the future to encourage compliance from the community.
Evan, what are your thoughts on masks?
On masks, I think it's appropriate for people to wear masks. I wear a mask and do all the hand sanitising as well. But mandating is a different issue. I think people can become annoyed at government edicts, especially forcing them to do something they might not want to, or it might not be appropriate in that circumstance to do so. On New South Wales more broadly, I think it is the right approach, because they know that starting and stopping the economy will plunge so many more businesses into debt, into closure, and hurt more livelihoods potentially than the health effects of the virus is. And you've got people calling for an elimination strategy, which will plunge more people into mortgage debt, defaulting, plunge more small businesses under. And the most people that are calling for this elimination strategy are doing so in positions that they'll never be they'll never be affected in any way by that call. And the question that needs to be asked to them is how many families going into poverty is acceptable for them? How many lives destroyed is acceptable? And I understand that they're coming from the position where their sole aim is to keep the numbers of the virus at zero, but it is just one consideration of many that needs to be made.
Moving on to another topic, the palace letters were released earlier this week and showing that the Queen did not play a part in the sacking of Gough Whitlam. Now there's the argument for Australia to become a republic. Well, it's been reignited. Where do you stand? We'll start with you, Evan.
Yeah, look, I think the palace letters were a bit of a fizzer. I think, constitutional experts like Anne Toomey even admit that the Queen couldn't have known and was deliberately kept out of the decision. Look, I'm a Republican myself. I think Australia should become a head of state. But frankly, the Republican movement has engaged in these conspiracy theories and gone down the rabbit hole for far too long. It's been over 20 years since the last Republic referendum, and we still don't have an acceptable model. In order to branch out, they're going to need to appeal across the aisle. They've already got the left. They've already got ABC boomers and academia. They need to reach out to people that do believe in an Australian head of state, but maybe are a little more conservative. Constitutional referendums are very difficult to win. And I think in order for the Republican movement to achieve that, they'll have to appeal to ideas of national sovereignty, national unity and equality, and also not throw the baby out with the bathwater. If we can become our own republic, as well as keeping the British institutions that made us great, like our liberal democracy, like our rule of law and so on, I think that'll go a long way to convincing Australians that we do need our own head of state.
Ebony, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think the letters show that the Queen just doesn't have a place in Australian politics?
Yeah, I do think that's the case. And I think Australia owes Professor Jenny Hocking a great debt of gratitude. Irrespective of what the letters show, I think it was appalling that they were kept secret for so long when they really do shine such a spotlight on a period of time where Australia's democracy faced a real crisis. And at the end of the day, I think what the letters show is, just the awful role that John Kerr played in this dismissal, where he wasn't even speaking to the Prime Minister for months on end, which is, just outrageous in a democracy. And historians will be poring over these letters for years to come. But I do think Australia should be a republic. I think it's great that the palace letters have sparked that debate again. But I also think it's important to look at other reforms to the Constitution that are important. We've had the Uluru Statement from the Heart that calls for recognition, a voice to Parliament, treaty making and a truth-telling process. And I think those are some really urgent reforms that Australia needs to embark on very soon. And, the Republic's been down the priority list, for some time. And while it's important, I think, there's other constitutional reforms that need equal weight, if not more.